I'm Rachel Cleet. I'm the section head for city planning here at the Knowlton School of Architecture, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Baumer lecture. June Manning-Thomas is going to be giving our lecture tonight, and she is the Centennial Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Michigan's Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. And she's also a fellow of the Institute of Certified Planners, and is a current president of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning. That's the organization or membership organization for those of us who train planners. Her research is looking at the diversification of the planning profession and planning history, and also social equity in neighborhoods and in urban revitalization. Her recent work has been looking at the role of minority race planners in a quest for a just city, exploring the relationship between the concept of social equity and the civil rights movement, and is examining the land use reactions of community organizations to vacant land in Detroit. She's the author of numerous articles and chapters, and has authored or edited or co-edited 7 books, including The City After Abandonment with Margie Dewar. And she's just put out a second edition, or recently put out a second edition of her book, Planning Progress, Lessons from Shoji Effendi, and is working on a volume that's in press on Detroit. As well as being tonight's Baumer lecturer, Dr. Thomas's talk is the kickoff for Social Justice Week, the new student organization, and has been working hard to create a series of events. Tomorrow, students have an opportunity to speak with Dr. Thomas at 10 a.m. in Knowlton 259. And all week, you can bring donations for the OSU Star House. OSU Star House provides homeless youth with a safe respite from streets, where they're able to meet their basic needs and connect with the larger social system. You can find donation boxes in Knowlton Hall lobby and also on the 4th floor of the CRP studio. And there's also a list, if you go to the website, there's a list of things they need donated. The other thing that I want to stress about the Social Justice Week is the Poetry Slam. 7 to 9 on Friday, Brothers Drake Meadery in Columbus at 26 East 5th Avenue. So I hope you'll come and join that as well. And now I'd like to hand the podium over to Dr. Thomas.
Good evening. Tonight I wanted to talk about some work I've been doing on equity planning, and I've been working on this for a number of years, but this particular talk is based on some work that I've been doing to just trying to understand what is happening in places like Detroit and to the whole concept of social justice and particularly equity planning because of the changes that the city is going through. So I have put together a PowerPoint. Most of the pictures are mine, and it's sort of showing kind of little glimpses of what we see in the city of Detroit, which is essentially the spread of blight and vacancy and foreclosures throughout working class, middle class, and even upper class. And certainly the lowest income neighborhoods have almost been completely devastated. But I became interested in this topic because I teach planning theory, and a lot of people have been talking about planning theory, talking about social justice for a long time. Recently, we've seen a lot of books that have come out on social justice, The Just City. And I was a little concerned because we're turning out these MUPs, these masters of urban planning, and many of them want to work in Detroit. We're about 40 miles away from Detroit. And so I began to think about what is this definition of equity planning and how is it affected by the status of cities like Detroit. So that's why I started this research and started thinking about this issue. This particular house, I believe so I'm involved in a research project that's looking specifically at 2 neighborhoods, and this particular one is in the northwest section of the city. So then the questions I had, does classic equity planning still have a role in distressed central cities? And I'll explain in a little while what I mean by classic equity planning, because I quickly ran into definitional problems. People talk about equity planning, they talk about advocacy planning, and in planning almost as if they're interchangeable, and they're not. And people talk about social justice in planning as if that's interchangeable with those others, and it's not. So I will define what I mean by classic equity planning. What does Detroit tell us about the challenges, and what is the role of equity? Oh, you're probably wondering about the house. So yes, this particular house, I'm pretty sure, is in the Brightmoor neighborhood, which is a northwest section of Detroit, and we've been seeing, of course, these hollowed-out houses throughout the city. What does Detroit tell us about the challenges, and what is the role of equity planning in such circumstances? So those are the three kinds of things that I'd like to talk about today. So I thought I'd start with Paul Davidoff. This is a photo. I actually found it in the archives. I had read about Paul Davidoff all of my career. I'd never seen a picture of him any younger than 60-ish or whatever. And so I found this photo, and the librarians gave me permission to use it occasionally. But Paul is, of course, the founder of this concept of advocacy planning. And to understand that, of course, you have to kind of go back through just to understand what context he was in. He was writing about the 1960s. I noticed on your webpage that you have a course, I think, on advocacy planning. So advocacy planning is very much associated with Davidoff. But when you go back and you read his most famous article on this, from the Journal of what was then American Institute of Planners, you understand that really his original concept of advocacy planning was very different than most people think of today. His original article is really about pluralism. He talked about everyone needing an advocate. He specifically says Democrats, Republicans. He talks about the different groups of people that need this particular form of assistance, which would be urban planning. And this is a little chart that kind of shows. So one of his big contributions was to kind of help planning to understand that indeed there's not just one public interest, but they're fragmented publics. And his main idea was the advocate planner should work for one of those publics. So the advocate planner is really an advocate for a particular subset of people, and that's the original use of the term. He did mention using that specifically for people who were low income or racial minorities, but if you read that article, it's a very small portion, although his life was entirely different. His whole life was devoted to trying to support racial equality and trying to support desegregation in the suburbs, and he was an activist in the best sense of the word. He really did act to promote the principles that he believed in. But his original, the most widely published definition is really more diverse than that. And he was operating in the 60s, which is a particular context, so he wasn't operating alone. He was operating with a forerunner of Planners Network, which was called Planners for Equal Opportunity, and they actually had a much more diverse definition of what was needed in terms of social justice. They labeled it advocacy planning after a while, but that really meant supporting the needs of racial minorities. The definition then became more civil rights oriented. So it really, and Paul Davidoff was a part of that, so certainly the definition morphed. Norman Krumholtz basically, of course, created the term equity planning, and the seminal article for that is in 1975, and I'm sure many of you have read that. And I think I should point out that article was, of course, co-authored with several planners from the city of Cleveland. It was published in a special issue that also included other commentary, and actually looking back at that issue, it's just as interesting to read the commentary as it is to read the original article. In the article, Krumholtz and his colleagues are essentially explaining why they were taking this different approach to planning that they chose to call equity planning. They did not choose to call it advocacy planning. They chose to call it equity planning. And of course, in the article is a definition which I'm going to describe as the classic. Remember, I said I would talk about the classic definition of equity planning. So the main point of that most people are aware of is this idea that government should pay attention to those with fewest choices. He really talked about local government needing to do this, not just planners, but local government as a whole needed to pay attention to those with fewest choices. And then he defines, or the trio defines, and the Cleveland Policy Plan defines what that means. It meant a lot of things. It meant racial minorities, it meant low-income people, it meant the disabled, it meant the elderly. And there are actual definitions of that. So again, we are morphing definitions as we don't always mean all those things when we say equity planning. But I think what was really pivotal about his concept was that he adopted this approach that there's not one unitary public interest, which was very different from the way people approached planning before. In the 50s, for example, planners were taught that there is one public interest and you do one comprehensive plan, and that public interest is, of course, known by the planner who would know what's best for the public. And that was the ethos. That's the way people thought about urban planning. And so if you use urban planning, for example, for urban renewal or redevelopment, it was okay because you were doing it in the public interest. So this idea of the fragmented public that Davidoff had suggested was in fact the case, was picked up by Krumholtz. And Krumholtz and Party, and of course Krumholtz went on to publish other things as well, said that they were essentially picking up this idea of a diverse public, not just a unitary public. And they specifically said that they would focus on those with fewest choices, which I'm going to, as a shorthand, call the disadvantage. But they explicitly said, well, no, this is not plural. This is not for different publics to have their own planner. We actually will speak on behalf of those with fewest choices. And this is how we define that. So I should point out a couple of things. One is that by the time they came up with this view, conditions had changed. So in the time of Davidoff's first presenting this concept, there actually were federal programs that would have allowed local community organizations to hire their own planner. It was the Model Cities program, or it was the Office of Equal Opportunity, the War on Poverty program. By the time Krumholtz came along, the federal policy had changed, and this was not possible anymore. It really was very difficult to figure out how poor people could hire their own planner. You could do that in the 60s because of those programs, but it was very difficult. So his changing to equity planning was really a pragmatic act. It was the idea that he was picking up on the social justice concerns of Davidoff, but at the same time, he was essentially adjusting to an era when it wasn't clear who would hire a planner who was devoted to social justice. That wasn't clear anymore. It was clearer in the 60s. So he essentially looked at this situation, he as planning director, and said, well, we have to change. And so he developed this idea that really, this idea that government should attend to those with fewest choices is particularly a responsibility for urban planners. That it's urban planners' role to make sure that they aim their policies toward those, to the benefit of those who had the fewest choices, namely the disadvantaged. So it was the whole responsibility of all of government, but particularly for urban planners. He also had other portions of what I'm calling the classic definition of equity planning. One was that there needed to be a connection between pragmatism and activism. So activism then needed to be grounded in the pragmatic act of survival in City Hall. So it wasn't just a matter of protesting and advocating and rabble-rousing, some people might say, but it was also grounding this in the politics of survival. And many of his writings in that particular article, as well as future articles, was about the politics of survival. How do you actually survive 3 mayors? How do you make sure that you please your council? All of these things were very much a part of what he was saying. But I'd like to point out that he was doing this in terms of working within City Hall. Notice a difference compared to the advocacy planning. He was saying you needed to do this as you work within City Hall. So the classic definition of equity planning was essentially those planners working for the public, which was defined as those with fewest choices in particular, although the public in general as well, working within City Hall. And so it's a subset of the whole advocacy planning movement, a subset of the social justice movement, very much tied to the city bureaucracy. And he further says that it's important, particularly in distressed cities. So places like Cleveland, he says, essentially needed to make sure that they undertook equity planning because they had so many people that needed help, that needed to have government attend to their problems. I will point out here that this definition of equity planning actually resolves some of the problems of advocacy planning. Because advocacy planning, I've already explained, there was nobody to hire these people. There was no federal money to pick them up. Model cities had gone away by the time this article came out. There was no more war on poverty. That died with, maybe it died with Kennedy, certainly with Johnson leaving. That was all gone. So it was really a pragmatic act. It was an invention to adjust to the circumstances of a city that was experiencing distress and increasing numbers of disadvantaged people. But it actually did have some very interesting characteristics. For example, the people who worked on equity planning, you can read through his writings, were competent people. They essentially were pragmatic in an effective way. They did keep their jobs. They were able to make changes. And his writings are about those changes. They also talked about specific areas that needed to be addressed. So the actual Cleveland policy plan is not widely available. You are more likely to read the articles about it, but I have seen a copy of the actual plan itself. It's about 50 pages long, the policy plan. And I've just looked at sort of what were they actually saying in terms of what should change in the city of Cleveland. And they looked at things like income and housing and transportation and community development. And what I found particularly interesting is that for each of these areas, they did say some things that needed to change for the benefit of disadvantaged people, but they also said things that needed to be for the benefit of the whole. So it was actually a combination of public interest plus targeting of specific benefits to the disadvantaged. So that, for example, for housing, they said, well, yes, there should be some sort of earmarking of dollars of city funds to make sure that whenever the city supports development, that the money that comes back into the city coffers should not be limited to that particular development area. They should go to needy neighborhoods. That's the implication. So that's a distributional kind of goal. But they also have other provisions for housing that say something such as, well, if there's going to be money spent, city money spent on improving conditions for housing, then the owner needs to pay, essentially reimburse the city. If, for example, the city has to come out and do some upkeep or something of that sort. So it was really a balance of kinds of provisions, but the overall strategy was, in fact, changing benefit patterns. There were a lot of precursors in the original 1975 plan to what we now call community benefit agreements. There were provisions that said that if the city is going to provide money for corporations or for businesses or for developers of upper income housing, then they should also look for jobs for residents and so on and so forth. These are distributional kinds of goals. And they assumed that there would be a city there that would have the agency and the money to essentially divert those benefits to people who were needy. So, in that original special issue that I told you about, the one in 1975, which was the big splash of the Cleveland Policy Plan report with the summary by the three planners, there were, as I said, there were these commentaries, and one of the commentaries was by Paul Davidoff. And Paul Davidoff read the Cleveland Policy Plan and said, "This is great!" So I know that he liked it. You know, he kind of raved on about how this was the best example that he had seen of essentially a city that was carrying out the principles of social justice, that Cleveland was doing it when nobody else was doing it. Even though in their article they did not cite Davidoff. They did not say this is advocacy planning. They said something else. But still, there were clear intellectual connections. But there was another article in that special issue, and that article was by Herb Gans, who is the author of The Urban Villagers and several other works. And what Herb Gans said was great, wonderful. It's wonderful to see the Cleveland's planners are doing a great job, but they are talking about a distressed city, and these cities are distressed because people are leaving, because people are going to suburban areas. There's no hint that that's going to reverse. So eventually they're going to run out of money. And what's going to happen then? These planners who want to promote social justice will have to do cutback planning. And it's interesting to go back and read his article, because what he's saying is, essentially, you guys don't have the money for this. You don't have eventually you're going to run out of the resources to do anything distributional. So this was, just as there was an inherent contradiction or an inherent problem in advocacy planning, which was, who's going to pay me to be an advocate planner? There was also an inherent difficulty in equity planning, and that inherent difficulty was, well, what if we don't have enough money to do redistribution? What if we collapse in terms of our fiscal capacity? And that's exactly the situation we're facing in Detroit now. It's almost as if Herb Gans has come back to say, I told you so. Yeah. So he was saying, yes, this is a great idea, but you really need to think about this. So we do need to think about that. Nevertheless, I think the concept of equity planning is still a very good concept, and it's still very popular. And I think there are a couple of reasons for this. This, by the way, this is a photo of the late, great Brewster Douglas Projects, one of the public housing projects in Detroit. You can see there's graffiti on the bottom of it. It's either demolished, I haven't driven by it yet, or it's going to be demolished very soon. But I chose that photo because I think it's sort of symbolic of the fallen grace of social justice, because, of course, the public housing program was designed specifically for the disadvantaged or working poor, and now we're seeing the collapse of that program. But the concept of equity planning, I think, has survived for several reasons. One is it's a very it's a doable kind of a strategy. You can teach planning students, you can teach people who are not planning students, other landscape architecture students or whomever, you can say your responsibility is to be sure that the policies that you promote take into account the needs of those who have the fewest choices or the disadvantaged. It's easy to understand. It's not abstract or theoretical, and they're examples. We have literature with examples. A lot of those are written by Krumholz, as well as Pierre Clavel has written some. John Forrester was a co-author on some of that. So we have documentation of some of the possibilities. It's in sort of embedded in the AICP Code of Ethics. There's a specific social justice passage which was actually there before equity planning was developed, and they built on that, but it's still in the AICP Code of Ethics for those who are AICP members. And of course, we have Planners Network. We have lots of agencies and organizations that are still promoting this concept of social justice. And we continue to need social justice. It's still a live issue. We're still trying to figure out how do you bring a city to a point that it can meet the needs of its citizens and of its region, and yet not totally ignore the needs of those who are disadvantaged. So it's still very much a concept. As I said before, we have a lot of people who are beginning to talk about social justice, and this one in particular is Susan Fanstein, who's just written a book, The Just City, which talks about that. And I just wanted to point out, one of the reasons I decided to embark on this project was I would read this literature and I would say to myself, well, where are the distressed cities in this? Because the examples were always New York City or London or Amsterdam. And I have a hard time envisioning applying lessons from Amsterdam to Detroit. So I think what's really helpful is her definitions, and I wanted to point out that she really has helped clarify the philosophical roots of this idea of social justice. And I think if for nothing else, I would recommend that you look at her work to see kind of what's a good synopsis of what the literature is saying in terms of social justice and planning. Maybe not read the Amsterdam chapter, but just the theoretical one. But for example, one of the things she points out is that we tend to think of the just city. Part of that is just outcomes. That is, we need for people to be able to have housing, to have jobs, to have access to food, all those things. But we also need democratic, what she calls democratic process. So we need sort of the process of people feeling that they have some voice, at least in terms of participation, in terms of what happens, and decisions about at least their community. And she sometimes, in some of her work, not others, she talks as well about the importance of diversity. Diversity in terms of population, in terms of immigrant groups, and so on and so forth. So I think, it's very interesting, but a lot of the discussion lately about the just city doesn't mention equity planning. It doesn't mention advocacy planning. But I think what equity planning gives us that the just city doesn't is this idea of agency, this idea that it's a moral commitment, a moral mandate for the practitioner to actually believe in the need for social justice and to actually promote social justice in all activity. So I wanted to tell you, so then, Detroit is a distressed city. So this is in the Brush Park section of Detroit, which is just north of the stadium. And it's one of the mansions that the city has tried to not demolish because of the hope that there will be redevelopment. It's been a redevelopment project for some time. And this photo I took on a clear day in Detroit, obviously. With in the background, this is actually sort of a new development on the edge of the old Brewster Douglas projects. And if you could see, if we had a bird's eye view, the projects that I shot would be back in this direction. And then I was taking a field trip down the street in Detroit one day, and I was walking these students along, and we were about to cross the street, and the light turned, and I said, wait, and I took out my camera because there was this great sign, "Nothing stops Detroit," which is really, I think, symbolic of the spirit of Detroiters. I think they've reached a point where when you can't do anything else, you talk about how great you are. It's sort of that spirit. So I decided not to talk about Detroit as a distressed city because I suspect you've heard about it. Raise your hand if you haven't. Really? No, I suspect you've heard about it. I mean, it's, there's bankruptcy, a steep decline in the 2000s. What you may not know is that from 2000 to 2010, the city lost 25% of its population, which is biggest drop probably in the country. So I guess I wanted to just use that opportunity to just kind of just talk a little bit about what the city has done about that. So essentially we have, or why look at Detroit? Let's talk about that. Why look at Detroit? Okay. Why talk about Detroit when you're talking about equity planning? I mean, it's a Cleveland thing, right? You guys, do you have that in Columbus? Do you have equity planning in Columbus? I don't know. It's a Ohio thing, right? So why talk about? Well, I think the fact that Detroit is in this situation makes it an extremely interesting case study. Because then you can ask, well, if Krumholtz said essentially that this is very important for a distressed city, can it survive in a really distressed city? Is it possible to really think about social justice and to really think about these issues in a distressed city? So that's one reason. And then another reason is there actually are planners who are dedicated to social justice. So for this project, I've been interviewing planners. I've interviewed about 12 planners and about 14 people on this particular project, and I'm asking them things like, what is social justice? Do you believe in social justice? Do you believe in equity planning, and so on? So there are people who actually do. Some of them are our alums who have come out. They're working in Detroit. They know what I mean when I say equity planning. They know what I mean when I say social justice, and yes, they believe in it. But there are a lot of strange things happening in Detroit, one of which is, of course, the turn toward bringing up the central business district and the midtown, but the other areas having more difficulty. So one of the things that's happened is that with this steep dive, there's been a renewed call for planning, and one of them is the Detroit Future City Plan, which was a plan based on the Detroit Works program, which was a process to try to figure out what to do with the city, and the what to do is necessary because so much of the city is now vacant and blighted. So they embarked upon this process with Mayor Bain at the head, and what it does is to essentially look at how do you reconfigure thinking about planning in this context. And I just took one image from the actual plan. So this is current land use, and this is the 50-year land use scenario. And although you can't see it, I can tell you that what's happening in these turquoise areas is, blue, does it come out that way? Yeah, those are the high vacancy areas in the city, the ones that and this is where I was taking some of the photos. And this is where they think maybe these areas would become something different. They're calling it green infrastructure and blue infrastructure, and green infrastructure means things like fields and agriculture and forestry, and these are the so-called traditional neighborhoods, the yellow. So I wanted to just then say, so there are indeed, as I was saying, there's still these ideas that there should be equity planning, and this particular shot is in the Grandmont Rosedale Minnick Park area. And I put this up because one of the examples of equity planning that I found is a planner who works in the Detroit City Planning Commission who essentially helped gardeners get some sort of ordinance for urban agriculture because they were totally illegal according to the zoning ordinance before that, and she has worked within City Hall to kind of help to make sure that they have the right to do that. I also found examples of planners who were fighting for the residents in order to protect them against institutional encroachment. I haven't yet gotten interviews from all those people, but I'm working on it to just sit and talk with them and see what they're doing and why they're doing that. And then, as I said, lots of interesting things are happening in Detroit, and one of them is this Detroit Future City. So what are the challenges for equity planning? Well, one challenge is this problem of capacity. So what's happening is that as the city has contracted, of course, the tax base has contracted, and this has very real implications just in terms of city staff. So one thing that's happening is that the streets aren't being plowed, the street lights are going out and not being repaired, sewers are bursting, and unless they're in front of Cobo Hall, they don't get fixed. There's a whole slew. Parks are being closed and not mowed in the summer. There's a whole slew of things that would be the opposite of what you would think of in terms of social justice, because, of course, there's some areas that are kept better than others, and then if you look at the metro area, it's a totally unjust situation in terms of a comparison between central city and suburbs. So what that means is that you have less capacity as well in city government because you can't pay people, people are leaving, people are being fired. So some of the people I've interviewed have talked about that. One person was just explaining the context of crisis, and she said, well, it's really demoralizing because I'm sitting in there was one point at which every week people were being called in one by one, and we were being asked, well, can you find another job? Would you be willing to work half-time? Can you maybe go work in another unit? And so there's sort of this contraction of the city. And this is why Detroit Future City was funded by foundations. It was taken outside of the city government rather than inside. But what I discovered as I was talking was the biggest concern in terms of social justice was not what I thought. I thought that they would talk about these things. I thought that people, when I spoke with these planners, that they would say things like, well, how can we plan when the neighborhood's falling to pieces? But instead, what I found when I asked just the broad question, what do you think about equity planning? What do you think about social justice? What are the challenges and what are the opportunities? Those were 4 of my questions for this. What I found was that everybody's mind was on this plan. It was a major plan. I haven't figured out yet how much it cost, but just in terms of Kresge Corporation's, Kresge Foundation's contribution, I counted up what they said year by year in their annual reports, and they alone spent $6.8 million on this plan. And they were just one of several foundations who pay for this plan, for consultants to come in from Harvard and from international venues for this. But the planners I talked with and the community people as well were, because I talked to 14 additional community people for another project, and they also mentioned Detroit Future City. The planners said that this was an example of the failure of social justice. They didn't call out the abandoned houses. They said it was the planning process. They were more disturbed by that than they were by and I'm looking out the window and hear the city's falling to pieces. And they say, well, no, it was a problem of lack of social justice. And I've tried to think of why this was called out so much, and I think part of it was there was so much press that was going to this effort, but also there were a lot of false starts. So the first portion of this planning process, people would actually, you guys are so nice, you're just sitting there listening to me. I went to some of those first meetings, and people were outraged. They were standing up in the audience screaming at the planners, what are you talking about, a plan? Who's going to fix my street lights? I mean, it was sort of like really raucous, just really. So it was a traumatizing experience for many of the people who thought they were doing this good thing in terms of creating a plan that would help to improve outcomes. But at the end of the day, even when they tried to tweak and fix the citizen engagement portion, many people that I interviewed didn't feel that there was actually any two-way communication. There was instead participation, but there wasn't dialogue, particularly about their neighborhoods. So this map that I showed you with the yellow areas, that map, these people whose area is now the wrong color, turquoise, they were never consulted one-on-one about their neighborhood. All of it took place at the city level. And then when the planners, the technical planners who were the consultants came in, they went into a room with a couple of people that were picked as the community representatives, and they decided. And people noticed that. People noticed that. So the opportunities for equity planning to fix efforts like that, I think I did discover that people did think that there were some things happening in Detroit that made the city function better, or would make the city function better, such as finally electing council by district. We have, of course, Mayor Duggan is a famed turnaround agent, and in the negotiation for bankruptcy, there is the idea of improving city services, because I think people are realizing that you can't fix a city if everybody's leaving it. But I think what dawned on me, what has dawned on me over the last couple of years, is that what's happening is a revision of the original classic definition. That this idea of being in a city where there's agency, where the planners are competent, where the city government is competent, where the planning director can last through 3 mayors is not happening in Detroit. And I think what needs to happen is this idea of visiting process, visiting discourse, visiting communication, again, which was not a part of the original equity planning model. You notice I didn't mention it. This idea of engaging the residents was not a part of that model, because from City Hall, you were supposed to do that in terms of your responsibility as a professional. So then, I suggest we need a new definition of what we see as equity planning in severely constrained cities. And I think there still needs to be attention to those with fewest choices, but when the majority of the city is made up of those with fewest choices, you have to temper that, because there's just not the money to do it. As Herb Gans warned, there would not be. There's still responsibility of urban planners. The pragmatism is really in bold now, because you have to be pragmatic to survive an environment like that. You still need to keep an eye on the disadvantaged. You have to essentially look at both outcomes and process. So just outcomes, but also discursive planning or communicative planning is still going to be more important than in that classic definition. And I'm finding that my students are now working within and outside of City Hall. They're working for nonprofits, environmental justice agencies. This idea of safe haven in City Hall to defend the needs of the disadvantaged is no longer a workable model. And somebody's got to talk about the regions. I think we have to continue to visit what's happening in suburban municipalities. They're the ones that really need to start watching out for the needs of the disadvantaged in the region. So is that enough for you? Great. Questions? Yes?
I think there's a very important role that architects play in city planning. And especially what you just mentioned now, that there should be some kind of planning environment that hits the whole city. How do you think our relationship should be closer so that maybe architects could represent the people and what they need? I think that's what's missing here, is that, like you said, the people are never represented, but hopefully as architects we can help voice the needs of the people and work with planners. Could that be a puzzle?
Yeah, sure. And the most obvious example would be, for example, with the idea of looking at affordable housing. I think a lot of the work that needs to be done is just rethinking what do we think of as good housing. So I know that there are broader implications than that, but I think the community development corporations need those kinds of ideas. The single room occupancy movement, this idea of looking at containers for single room occupancy, I think is really important. So I think it continues to be a challenge to kind of do that. Of course, the challenge for architects, just as the challenge for city planners for years was being tethered to City Hall, the challenge for architects is being tethered to clients, quite often. So it's a matter, again, it's the same problem. Who's going to pay us? It's actually the same problem, but with different answers, I think. So yes. And just, this idea, government attention to those with fewest choices, it's really beyond government now. I think it's like the planning and design professionals need to have this attitude as well. That essentially maybe some of my work is going to be building high-end residential facilities. My daughter, by the way, is an architect, or she was for 10 years. And so she kind of left it because she just the high-end, she couldn't take the high-end, high-end. But then maybe a little bit of time for some other work that isn't high-end. So maybe the high-end pays the bills, but then there's other pro bono work that's done to kind of balance that. I think that would be a very good way to deal with this issue, this ethical, this dilemma of how do you get past being bound to the person who's paying you or the institution that's paying you. Yes?
So you mentioned Herb Gantz's criticism of equity planning as being unsustainable redistribution. Do you think that perhaps that sort of dynamic comes about when planning is reactionary and is seeking to address symptoms instead of really getting at processes or getting at how the geography of the city itself is creating that inequality?
Well, I think actually for one of the classes I'm teaching, we've just been studying A.J. Jacobs' article comparing Toronto and Detroit. So I'm a little, my spirits are a little down right now, so forgive me, but I really think it's a metropolitan problem. And I think Gans mentioned that, and I think Krumholtz mentioned that. I don't think it's so much anymore what planners are doing in terms of income inequality. It's what the society is doing in terms of this redistribution of population, this sorting by social economic status. So if the metropolitan area is sorting by socioeconomic status, and what the central city is left with is the lowest socioeconomic status, then to place the burden on the planner of rectifying that, I think, is unfair, because the capital has moved out, the central city planner. Now, maybe we can put some responsibility on the suburban planner who's in the municipality that's not allowing multifamily units in, or is not allowing any hint of looking for people who are not willing to buy a house for a half-acre lot. But I don't think we can place the onus specifically on central city planners. So I think Gans wasn't criticizing so much as warning. He was saying, I see that you want to do this, but how are you going to do this? And he specifically cited suburbanization. The capital was leaving, and as I remember that article, he also said urban renewal has not worked to bring the middle class back. So how will you have the resources to do this redistribution you're talking about in this Cleveland plan when we don't have people that are willing to move back into the central city? So it's a broader problem than just the urban planner. It's really more the metropolitan structures, I think, is the problem. Yes?
Which is something that Davidoff kind of did, right? He ended up getting involved in sort of suburban planning and trying to create more equity, or create a situation where you could have more equity within the suburbs. I mean, do you think that is a strategy in terms of? I'm thinking about this in the context of teaching students
Yes.
this kind of topic. I mean, if you're is it best to kind of steer students towards trying to be more advocacy planners but in a suburban context?
Well, equity, so I prefer equity than suburban. Yeah, but I think, and Paul Davidoff did do that. His suburban action, I think he really did push. Of course, you have to think of the era. He died in the 80s. So in the era that he was doing that work from the 60s to the 80s with a really strong push on suburban action in the 70s and 80s, that was the frontier. You know, basically getting African American families into the suburbs was the frontier. But as we found with Mount Laurel and with experience, it's easier to desegregate by race than it is by income. And it's the income level issue that has really affected some of these central cities. So I think part of it is, yes, that we continue to encourage there to be free movement, but quite frankly, I think the challenge now is we still have, well, one is we have to continue to think about this metropolitan structure and how can we address that. But quite frankly, I think that one of the challenges is how do we reverse that flow with these young white professionals moving back into the central city without making people resentful of that. People are very quick to call out gentrification, you know, and yet I'm looking at this situation of capital constantly flowing out, and I'm trying to convince my young white students to move. I'm showing them places they could live, so they could move back in. Because this pattern, it's racially driven. It wasn't really a good pattern to begin with. It's causing sprawl, it's denaturing the rural areas. And I think the younger generation really does prefer, and certainly immigrant groups we know prefer urban environments, urban contexts, and that's, of course, the walkability discussion, the smart growth discussion, and all these kinds of things. Now, how do we do that with this history that we have of confrontation and disunity, racial disunity? And to be perfectly honest, it's not a totally irrational fear that people have when they see the young white professionals coming back in. Because in Detroit, for example, they're moving to the Central Business District and Midtown, which are not affordable anymore for people who had kind of survived all these years. And much of the rest of the city, where the large African American population lives, the city is predominantly, I think, is now 85% African American. There's nothing happening. There's no action. The neighborhoods I'm studying, so I mentioned that I'm studying two neighborhoods. One is on the northwest area. It's a well-integrated area. The other, and it's kind of surviving, but the other one I'm studying, I won't mention its name, but it's not surviving. And every 6 months, it's going downhill. So part of the resentment is all this money and all these tax incentives flowing into these favored areas while the rest of the city is kind of falling into the turquoise territory that I show with the Detroit Future City map. And people are afraid there's not going to be any effort to keep those neighborhoods going. So it still is kind of race and class as an issue. Yes.
So for the planner working within City Hall, working under a mayor, how do they actually accomplish equity planning, or they're sort of working at the discretion of the mayor?
Well, first, truth and advertising. First, I feel a disclaimer. I feel obliged to say that my daughter is in that situation. My daughter is working with the Detroit City Planning Commission. Every day I expect her to knock on the door and say she's lost her job. She survived for 3 years. So I kind of talk to them closely in that division about who's surviving and why. And what there seems to be happening is sort of like encouraged attrition. So some people are just looking because they've been encouraged to kind of leave. But the people who are surviving are the people, like my daughter basically is very good at grant writing. So she's gotten several grants to fix up Belle Isle. In that division, another survivor is the lady who helped get the urban agriculture ordinance And there are people, of course, who administer CDBG. So there's still a surprising number of people. I think the Detroit City Planning and Development Department still has well over 100 people working there. And the Detroit City Planning Commission is down from 20 to 4. So there are people that are there. And Duggan, this new mayor, and the emergency manager, of course I didn't mention him, but he's definitely there for at least another 6 months. He has decided to pull some functions back that had been devolved to other agencies, like quasi-public agencies, to pull them back into City Hall. So they may actually start hiring again, because somebody has to do what he wants to do in terms of fixing some basic services so that people will stay or stop leaving. So there is a role, but people have to be pragmatic. I think they have to figure out, how can you survive? I think they need lessons from Krumholz, because he knew how to do that. How do you survive in a hostile environment?